Hey everyone. Tonight we will step into the candlelit corridors of the Louvre Palace, where the soft scent of rice powder and the shimmer of pearls conceal a royal secret you've never heard before. Just imagine inside a locked chamber. The most powerful man in France stands before a mirror, but it is not the image the world thinks of him. Silk brushes gently against his skin. Golden embroidery catches the flickering firelight, and every careful touch of rosy powder makes the king's figure fade, giving way to a woman both regal and mysterious. This is a story so strange that, trust me, you won't survive the temptation to keep listening. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because this is a story best told in the quietest hours. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are sitting there, the soft light from the desk lamp falling down, and I will take you back to a night of the 16th century. Paris then had no car horns or flickering electric lights. Instead, there was the scent of mist mixed with the smoke of oil lamps, along with the distant sound of hooves echoing from the cobblestone streets. But tonight, the heart of the story does not lie in the bustling streets, but inside the Louvre Palace, the heart of France's power, where the ancient stone walls have witnessed countless intrigues, oaths, and secrets that history has tried to hide. You imagine yourself stepping through a dark wooden door, so heavy that every time it opened it let out a soft groan. Inside, the cool air of stone blended with the sweet fragrance of rare perfume, creating the feeling of being lost in another world. A world where a king not only wore a crown but also a shimmering honey-blonde wig. That man, Henry III, the last king of the Valois dynasty, was standing before a large gold-framed mirror, his eyes fixed on the reflection. In the flickering candlelight, his hands, slender and carefully groomed, adjusted each fold of the silk dress, embroidered with golden thread. The deep neckline revealed skin covered with fine powder, the fragrance of rice powder as gentle as if passing through a morning garden. Cool pearls sparkled, encircling his neck, while earrings trembled softly with each movement. The wig, softly curled, fell on either cheek, framing a face brushed with just enough rosy tint to lend a delicate charm without losing its authority. And then, in that very moment, Henry the King, fighting amid political and religious storms, disappeared. In the mirror, a woman appeared, Enriqueta, his deepest secret and his safest refuge. You might think, a king like this, how can he be both warrior and muse? But remember, this was a time when Europe was drowning in religious wars, when kingship was bound to the image of strength and masculinity, and precisely because of this, Henry, finding peace in magnificent gowns and private transformations, became even more special, almost like a silent act of rebellion. The story began in the year 1551, when a boy named Alexandre Edouard was born at Fontainebleau Palace. Imagine a vast palace with corridors so long that footsteps echoed like distant drums, ceilings adorned with Italian mythological paintings, and gardens trimmed to perfection down to the last rosebush. In that setting, this boy, who would later become Henry III, grew up with tastes completely different from other princes. While his brothers eagerly practiced riding, hunting, and fencing, Alexandre was captivated by wide gowns, sparkling hemps, and the refined conversations of noble ladies about Italian poetry or Renaissance painting. Can you picture it? A prince who would sit for hours watching ladies in waiting arrange flowers, or carefully observing how they pinned each jeweled hairpin. His mother, Queen Catherine de' Medici, a woman both shrewd and among the most powerful in Europe at the time, quickly noticed this difference. At first, she tried to correct it by assigning him to study more manly pursuits. But Catherine was not just a mother, she was a strategist. She understood that a different child, if managed skillfully, could become a powerful piece on the political chessboard. Then one day, at the age of 9, Alexandra disappeared during a religious festival. The entire palace searched in panic. Finally, he was found in the private chamber of a noblewoman, wearing her most splendid gown, and declaring himself a princess locked in the tower. When confronted by his father, he calmly replied, "I only wanted to know what it feels like to be as beautiful as the ladies." If you were a warrior king like Henry II, you can imagine how furious he was. He punished his son, brought in stricter tutors, hoping to cure this softness. But as usual in history, prohibitions only forced secrets deeper underground. Alexandra learned to live a double life: outwardly, the model prince, inwardly searching for another self. In the years that followed, Catherine quietly allowed her son to spend time in the women's quarters, provided absolute secrecy was kept. In that space, Alexandra began to practice everything from graceful movements and a softened voice to the art of makeup. He learned to dance, to arrange flowers, even how to coordinate the colors of gowns so that candlelight would reflect most beautifully. This was not just play, but a form of artistic creation, and the only way he could escape the pressure of becoming a proper king in the future. Yet fate would not allow him to remain in that safe box forever. At Orthien, Alexandra was given command of the royal army by his brother. It might sound ironic, a man who loved gowns and poetry leading troops to war. But the very qualities once dismissed as weakness, his sensitivity, keen observation, and rich imagination turned him into a brilliant strategist. On the battlefield, he was calm, subtle, and able to grasp the psychology of his opponents. After great victories, he would disappear into his private tent for hours, and when he emerged, he always carried a gentle floral fragrance, as though coming from a ball rather than a bloody campaign. His soldiers whispered, "Don't ask. It will be better for everyone." Then in the year 1573, the chance to change his life arrived. Thanks to diplomacy and a few strategic bribes from his mother, Alexandra was elected King of Poland. Far from Paris, he was freer. In Warsaw, he built a court of unprecedented luxury, bringing with him handsome young Frenchmen whom the Polish nobility mockingly nicknamed the Darlings les Mignons. Behind closed doors, these darlings and the king transformed themselves into European ladies, with silk gowns, wigs, and even sensual dances. A Venetian ambassador once wrote of the scene with a mixture of amazement and horror. The king appeared as a strangely beautiful woman, with an artificial bosom, so artful that it could deceive anyone. But this dream was short-lived. In the year 1574, his brother died, leaving the French throne vacant. Henry was forced to return to Paris. And from here, the story would move into an entirely different chapter, where power, love, secrets, and the most exquisite gowns coexisted in a dynasty on the verge of collapse. Picture this: after months of freedom in Poland, Henry III returned to Paris, not only with a new crown, but also with an entourage glittering in sequined garments that sparkled in the sun. Their French perfumes so strong that the crowds lining the streets whispered about them. He entered the capital as though it were the grandest stage of his life, and in truth, for Henry, it was indeed a stage, except that the audience here was not easy to please. The coronation at Reims Cathedral was solemn, the organ resounding, incense rising into the lofty vaults. But Henry knew well from this moment. Every gaze would scrutinize his every move. The French court at that time was like a giant chessboard, where each step could lead to bloodshed. The factions of radical Catholics and Huguenot rebels had been at odds for years, and the new king would have to play both mediator and strategist to keep his throne. Yet Henry did not abandon his private self. In the very first months of his reign, he turned the Louvre into a dazzling cultural centre like never before. Painting, sculpture, music, fashion all flourished. Court banquets became legendary, where wine flowed like rivers and garments of such splendour made the whole of Europe envious. And, of course, his mignons appeared everywhere young, handsome men with softly curled hair, pristine lace collars, silver rings on their fingers, always close to the king, like guardians of beauty itself. Parisians whispered, calling them the stars of Henry, half in admiration, half in mockery. Behind the glittering facade, in closed rooms, Henry and his intimates continued their elaborate transformations. Candlelight reflected in mirrors. The rustle of silk filled the air, and the scents of lavender and roses spread throughout the chamber. On those evenings, Henry was not the monarch trapped between two warring religions. He was Enriqueta, a regal lady stepping out of a dream, freer than ever. What is remarkable is that Queen Louise de Lorraine, the wife everyone assumed was merely a political facade, became an unexpected ally. She not only accepted the truth about her husband, but sometimes even joined in those masquerades. At times, it was her hand that placed the hairpin in Henry's wig, or adjusted the ribbon on his silk gown. In such moments, their love transcended the standards of any royal marriage. But outside the palace, the storms grew fiercer. Political enemies began to use Henry's private life as a weapon. They spread pamphlets portraying the king in women's clothing, with accusations that he was degenerate, weak, and unfit to rule. In an era when royal power was tied to images of virile masculinity, this was a devastating blow to his reputation. The radical Catholic faction, led by the powerful Guise family, ceaselessly stirred the people. They did not only seek to overthrow Henry, but to replace him with a king entirely obedient to Rome. Tensions reached their peak in May of 1588, the day history calls the Day of the Barricades. Imagine Paris waking up to the frantic tolling of church bells. The streets blocked by wagons of wood, barrels of wine, and anything the people could use as barricades. The soldiers of Guise flooded the alleys, Catholic flags flying in the wind. Henry, caught off guard, and without enough forces, was forced to abandon the palace, fleeing in humiliation. At Blois, far from everything he loved, Henry fell into depression. No more Enriqueta. No more mignons. No more glittering light of the banquets. He grew thin, his eyes sunken, and often sat silently for hours by the window, gazing out at the cold gardens of the castle. Then a bold or desperate thought struck him. On December 23rd, 1588, Henry invited his greatest enemy, Duke Henry de Guise, to a private meeting at Blois. Guise believed this was a negotiation, but as he entered the chamber, the king's soldiers were waiting. Within seconds, cold steel ended the life of the man who had once thrown Paris into turmoil. The next morning, Guise's brother, a powerful cardinal, was also executed. It was an unprecedented shock, and instead of consolidating his power, this act left Henry utterly isolated. The Catholics saw him as a traitor. While the Protestants remained wary, he had almost no allies left. In the final months of his life, Henry lived surrounded by anxiety. No more masquerades. No one close enough to confide in. He was like an empty shell, left only with memories of the days when he had been both king and queen. On the morning of August 1st, 1589. A young friar named Jacques Clément requested an audience with the king, claiming urgent intelligence. Henry, weary and perhaps yearning for a spark of hope, agreed. But when they were alone, Clément drew a dagger and plunged it into the king's stomach. Henry collapsed, blood spreading across his clothes, his breath faltering. All through the night, he lay dying. In a lucid moment, he summoned Henry of Navarre, an old ally. Though a Protestant and confessed, "You see, I die because I was too slow to recognize who truly serves God." At dawn on August 2nd, 1589, at the age of 37, Henry III breathed his last. The Valois dynasty ended, and with it, a secret world where power, art, love, and personal freedom blended, vanished forever. History once called him a weak, eccentric, even sickly king. But looking deeper into diaries, letters, and rare accounts, you find a far more complex figure, a warrior who loved beauty, a politician who lived two lives, and a soul who longed to be himself. If only behind closed doors. If you thought a king like Henry III would have a string of arranged marriages, many mistresses, and heirs, then, I'm sorry, you will be slightly disappointed. His entire life, he had only one lawful wife, Louise de Lorraine-Vaudemont. This marriage, at first glance, was entirely political. When Henry ascended the throne, the Catholic faction wanted him to wed a devout Catholic noblewoman to strengthen his position against the Protestants. Louise, an intelligent and gentle noblewoman of the prestigious Lorraine family, was the perfect choice. The wedding took place in 1575 at Reims. Just a few months after Henry's coronation, Paris at that time rejoiced as if celebrating twice, once for the new king, once for the new queen. But what astonished the court was not the grand ceremony, but Louise's wedding gown. Henry himself designed it, choosing each fabric, each stitch, even arranging her hairstyle that very morning. It was said that when Louise entered the church, the light reflected off the thousands of pearls pinned in her hair so dazzlingly that the entire congregation fell silent for a few seconds. At first, many doubted whether this was truly a marriage or merely a diplomatic front. Henry was already famous for his mignons and his secret masquerades. But over time, Louise proved she was not just a queen in name. She became his confidante, his silent ally, and sometimes the only person who could pull Henry out of his bouts of melancholy. Picture this on quiet evenings. When the court slept, Henry and Louise sat in their private chambers, talking for hours about topics no king of that time would dare discuss with his wife: makeup techniques, color coordination of outfits, the most beautiful Italian love poems. Sometimes Louise sat in a chair while Henry stood behind, gently curling his wig in front of the mirror, and she would adjust each strand for him. It was not the fiery love of a novel, but a strange, enduring companionship, a bond that rose above conventions. Yet their marriage carried a void that could not be filled. They had no children, not for lack of trying, but perhaps because Henry was never truly oriented toward family life, in the traditional sense. In the context of the 16th century, a king without a direct heir was a severe political problem. This gave his opponents more grounds to attack, painting Henry as an incomplete, weak monarch, beyond Louise. Henry's private life revolved around his mignons, the intimate and enigmatic circle of attendants. They were not only drinking companions or hunting partners, they were an inseparable part of his private world. Many of them came from minor nobility, or even lower classes, brought into court by Henry, showered with titles and wealth. The intimacy between the king and his mignons stirred endless rumors in the court, but Henry did not care. It is said that on certain evenings at the Louvre, in a chamber filled with mirrors and candlelight, Henry and his mignons would transform themselves into European ladies, silk gowns flaring wide, glittering jewelry, rosy cheeks, red lips, and then they would reenact scenes from plays or poems they loved. Louise sometimes appeared as well, not to object, but to smile softly as she watched her husband tilt his head like a young lady waiting to dance. You might think, with such a colourful private life, Henry must have lived in a world completely detached from politics. But the truth is that the two worlds, public and secret, were always intertwined, influencing one another. The masquerades gave him relaxation, but they also became weapons for his enemies to smear him. When the radical Catholics distributed pamphlets, they did not hesitate to depict Henry in female form, or to hint at overly intimate relations with his attendants. In a society where masculine imagery was tied directly to military strength, this was nothing less than a direct assault on royal authority. Henry had to fight not only to protect his throne, but also to protect the part of himself he most cherished. Henry was not a man who only lived in luxury. He understood that the country was deeply divided between Catholics and Protestants. Instead of throwing all his power into crushing the other side, Henry tried to find a balance. He signed several treaties to ease tensions, granting Protestants religious freedom in certain regions, while reassuring Catholics that the crown remained loyal to Rome. It was a subtle strategy, but it also left him mistrusted by both sides. Catholics saw him as weak. Protestants thought him indecisive. Henry also left his mark in administration. He restructured the tax system, attempted to reduce corruption among officials, though not always successfully. Since factional interests were entrenched, he emphasized law and order, particularly in Paris, where he had oil lamps installed to make the city safer at night, a rarity at that time. In military affairs, Henry was not a warlike king, but he was not weak. When necessary, he could act decisively, such as personally commanding the suppression of radical Catholic uprisings or deploying troops to guard the borders against Spanish threats. Yet he always saw war as a last resort, preferring negotiation over bloodshed. A distinctive feature of Henry's rule was his use of ceremony and imagery to strengthen authority. Audiences, banquets, processions, all were staged as grand performances. Every detail, from the color of the tablecloth to the choice of flowers, carried political meaning. When receiving foreign envoys, Henry might appear in gleaming armor to display power, but the very next day, he would don an embroidered silk robe to emphasize refinement and intellect. Of course, not everyone admired this style. Some traditional nobles derided him as too soft and removed from the battlefield. But Henry knew one thing: well, power did not lie only in swords, but in making others believe you controlled everything, even the atmosphere of a room. Now imagine the morning of August 2nd, 1589. The summer sunlight fell on the military camp at Saint-Cloud, but brought no warmth. News spread like wind through the tents. The king is dead. Henry III, the last king of the Valois line, had breathed his last only hours before. After a long night of agony from the friar Jacques Clément's fatal dagger wound, no solemn bells tolled. No cannon salutes marked his passing. Only whispers and heavy gazes. The French court at that moment was like a rudderless ship adrift on a stormy sea. What matters is that Henry III had just managed to leave behind one vital last testament. On his deathbed, he called Henry of Navarre, once an ally in wars against the Catholic League, to his side and said, "You see, I die because I was too slow to recognize who truly serves God. You must be king." It was the way Henry III officially named Navarre, a Protestant, as heir to the throne of France. It may sound simple. The king dies. The successor ascends. But in reality, as you know, France in 1589 was a shattered hive. The Catholic League, led by the Guise family and backed by Spain, immediately rejected Navarre. To them, a Protestant king was unthinkable. In Paris, the news provoked fury and mourning. Many churches rang their bells as though tolling the death knell of the entire monarchy, not just of Henry III. Navarre, now officially Henry IV, faced a France torn in two, the north and centre, especially Paris, held by radical Catholics. The southwest and some neighbouring regions stood with him, mainly Protestant strongholds. On the map, the territory loyal to the new king appeared as scattered fragments, like faint lanterns flickering in a stormy night. The military situation became urgent. Henry IV had no time for a splendid coronation like previous kings. Instead, he donned armour and led his troops into relentless battles against the Catholic League. Engagements such as Arques 1589 and Ivry 1590 were not only clashes of swords and gunfire, but also battles of symbols on one side, the heretic king as his enemies mocked him, and on the other, the defender of the Catholic faith. You can imagine the battlefield of Ivry on a March morning in 1590 as a sea of mist. Horses neighing, banners fluttering. Henry IV rode a white horse, with a white plume on his helmet, shouting, "If you lose sight of me in battle, look for the white plume." This phrase later became legendary. But behind the heroic image was a cold truth. Though he won at Ivry, he still could not capture Paris. The city, exhausted by famine, continued to resist, sustained in part by Spanish supplies. Meanwhile, the death of Henry III was still the subject of many rumours. The radical Catholics regarded Jacques Clément as a martyr who had liberated France from a sinful king. On the other side, supporters of Henry IV saw the act as a cowardly assassination, aiding foreign powers. This controversy only deepened the divide between the two factions. Politically, the French throne was no longer a symbol of unity, but a prize in a deadly race. Henry IV, though the legitimate heir, was still considered an outsider by most Parisians and the Catholic nobility. To survive, he had to fight battles, while also trying to persuade his opponents, an almost impossible task. From 1589 to 1593, France sank into civil war. Roads lay in ruins. Harvests failed. Merchants abandoned the markets. And the countryside was plundered by both regular troops and mercenaries. In this context, many people began to long for the reign of Henry III, though when he lived, they had mocked him as extravagant and weak. At least under his rule, Paris still glowed with candlelight, whereas now only the black smoke of war remained. Henry IV finally realized to unite France, he had to change strategy. And so in 1593, at the Church of Saint-Denis, he declared his conversion to Catholicism with the famous line, "Paris is well worth a mass." This move ended most of the opposition, paving the way for his official coronation at Chartres in 1594. Since Paris was still unsafe, when Henry IV entered Paris, the city was exhausted after years of siege. People poured into the streets, cheering and looking at him with curiosity mixed with caution. It was the moment France closed a long chapter of religious wars, a chapter that had begun decades earlier and reached its violent climax in the final years of Henry III. And the legacy of Henry III, though shrouded in rumour and controversy, he left a clear mark, a court that valued art, ceremony, and imagery to the point of turning them into instruments of power, a style of rule both soft and at times explosively ruthless, and a personal story that made him one of the most enigmatic kings in French history. Years later, historians would still debate if Henry III had not been assassinated in 1589. Could he have negotiated a peace settlement like Henry IV achieved? Or was the polarized nature of France at that time such that whoever sat on the throne had no choice but to take sides and face the consequences? The question still lingers, an unsolved mystery. But one thing is certain, his death opened the way for a new era. With the Bourbon dynasty and Henry IV, the very man he had entrusted with power, becoming the symbol of political pragmatism. And though people remember Henry III with every kind of rumour, somewhere in the hidden corners of history, the image of the king in a silk gown, gazing at himself in the mirror of a closed chamber, still lives on as a reminder that power and true self can never fully merge. After Henry III breathed his last on that summer morning of 1589, the entire camp at St. Cloud seemed to sink into heavy silence. But within that silence, a new chapter of French history was already unfolding, and its central figure was Henry of Navarre. You can picture Henry of Navarre then as utterly different from the glittering royal image of Henry III. He was a true warrior, sun-darkened from years of campaigning, his gaze direct and sometimes mischievous, his beard neat but not elaborate, and his style of dress more practical than ostentatious. He had no entourage of lace-clad mignons, not dazzling banquets, but he did possess what France needed most, the ability to command troops and the patience of a man who knew how to wait for the right time. Henry of Navarre was a cousin of King Charles IX and belonged to the Bourbon line, a junior branch of the royal family. He had been the leader of the Huguenots, French Protestants, during the brutal years of the religious wars. Henry III's decision to designate him as successor was daring and almost guaranteed to ignite conflict. Indeed, I did. As soon as the news spread, the Catholic League, led by the Guise family, immediately declared that Henry IV, his new title, was not a legitimate king because he was a heretic. In Paris, church bells rang as calls to resistance, and crowds gathered outside, raising banners against the new monarch. Meanwhile, Catholic nobles, allied with Spain, worked frantically to put forward a true Catholic candidate for the throne. Henry IV knew well he was entering a struggle, fought not only with swords but with hearts and minds. He needed to consolidate power quickly before his opponents could unite. But the territory loyal to him at the time was scattered Navarre in the south, a few towns in the west and southwest, and some loyal strongholds in the centre. Paris, the political heart and symbol of the throne, remained firmly in the hands of the Catholic League, supported by Spain. Instead of recklessly attacking, Henry IV chose to fight cautiously, one battle at a time. The Battle of Arques in September 1589 was one such example. In the thick morning fog, Henry IV's outnumbered army held firm against repeated assaults. This victory boosted the morale of his troops and proved to the nation that he was not a king of parchment but a true leader. Then came the Battle of Ivry in March of 1591, of the most famous battles in French history. Henry IV rode a white horse, wearing a massive white plume, and shouted the words that chronicles still repeat: "If you lose sight of me in battle, look for the white plume." He led his troops forward, crushing the forces of the Duke of Mayenne, the leader of the Catholic League at that time. But even after these victories, Henry IV still could not capture Paris. The city resisted fiercely, partly out of loyalty to the Catholic League, partly because of Spanish supplies. Henry IV laid siege to Paris. But when famine reached horrific levels inside, he ordered that women and children be allowed to leave the city, a gesture that won admiration from many, but which hardliners criticized as weak. In the years that followed, Henry IV remained persistent. He fought not only with swords but also with diplomacy. He courted neutral nobles, sought support from undecided regions, and above all crafted the image of a king who cared for common people, something his rivals often neglected. The greatest problem remained religion. A Protestant king in an overwhelmingly Catholic country was nearly impossible to accept. Henry IV understood that if he wanted to unify France, he had to choose between personal faith and the crown. And so, in 1593, he made his historic decision. He converted to Catholicism at the Church of Saint-Denis. The famous phrase, "Paris is worth a mass," was born both pragmatic and deeply political. After his conversion, the gates of Paris opened. In 1594, Henry IV entered the capital as a victor. But without arrogance, he knew the city had suffered too much war. Famine, religious strife. On the day he entered Paris, the people filled the streets, some cheering, others silent and watchful. But at least, for the first time in years, they saw a king truly present in the capital. Henry IV then set about healing the country's wounds. He reduced taxes for peasants, encouraged agricultural production, rebuilt infrastructure, and expanded trade. Most notably, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting limited religious freedom to Protestants, a groundbreaking step for the time, though still controversial. On a personal level, Henry IV was completely different from Henry III. If Henry III was the king of ceremony, fashion, and art, then Henry IV was the king of action, hunting, and pragmatic policy. But they shared one similarity: both understood that the crown was not only power, but also the art of survival amid political storms. The rise of Henry IV marked the end of the Valois dynasty and the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty, a dynasty that would lead France into a golden yet turbulent age, lasting more than 2 centuries. And if not for the final testament of Henry III, French history might have taken a very different path. If you were to place Henry III and Henry IV opposite each other at the same table, you would immediately see 2 completely different worlds. Henry III, in his gold-embroidered robe, a glass of wine on a finely patterned cloth, surrounded by candlelight and soft music, seemed to be living in a grand performance. Henry IV, by contrast, was much simpler. A wooden table, a jug of red wine, a plate of hot roast meat, hearty laughter mingling with the smell of smoke. One was a dazzling stage, the other, a lively military camp. Henry III ruled like a master of theatre. He believed in the power of image, of grand ceremonies, of fashion and art. Every time he appeared in public, it was a new performance, where every stitch and every colour carried political meaning. His court was a great play, and he the lead actor. By contrast, Henry IV chose a completely different approach. He rarely cared for elaborate rituals. He preferred to appear among the people, riding through villages, shaking hands with peasants, talking with craftsmen. He ate and drank like an ordinary man, valuing closeness over ostentation. For Henry IV, the direct connection with the people was the most important ritual of all. Their styles of leadership were also different. Henry III relied heavily on his circle of intimates, the mignons, and on political alliances built through personal favour. He used subtlety and flexibility to balance Catholics and Protestants, but his hesitation and devotion to ceremony made him appear out of touch with the battlefield and with daily life. Henry IV, seasoned by years of war, ruled with decisiveness and pragmatism. He was willing to change strategy if it helped achieve his goals, as shown in his decision to convert to Catholicism to unite the nation and act seen as pragmatic, but one that ended decades of bloodshed. On religion, Henry III tried to find balance but was ultimately distrusted by both sides. He signed peace agreements but was still attacked by extremists, and it was a Catholic friar who assassinated him. Henry IV faced the same challenge, but instead of trying to please both camps, he chose one Catholicism and used the Edict of Nantes in 1598 to reassure Protestants with limited freedom. His decision was not only political, but also reflected his willingness to sacrifice personally for national peace. In economics and daily life, Henry III was famous for lavish banquets and cultural splendor, raising French painting, music, and fashion to new heights. But to sustain such a court, heavy taxes burdened peasants, and constant wars worsened their hardships. Henry IV chose another path. He reduced peasant taxes, promoted agriculture, improved roads, and expanded trade. His motto, "Every peasant will have a chicken in the pot on Sunday," was not just a promise but a leadership philosophy. The people must be fed for the country to be strong. Their treatment of enemies also reflected their differences. Henry III often relied on temporary treaties and fragile alliances. But when cornered, he could act ruthlessly, as in the assassination of the Duke of Guise in 1588. That act left him isolated and hastened his political downfall. Henry IV, on the other hand, once secure in power, often sought to turn enemies into allies through marriage, titles, or economic incentives. He was willing to forgive those who had opposed him, if it meant consolidating lasting peace. The legacies they left behind were also different. Henry III closed the Valois dynasty with an image both romantic and tragic, a king who was at once a warrior, an artist, and a man who lived two lives, public and secret. He left behind a splendid court, ceremonies staged as art, and a personal story so unique that it made him one of the most unforgettable figures in French history. Henry IV, on the other hand, opened the Bourbon dynasty with a unified France, an economy in recovery, and a pragmatic model of leadership that placed national interest above all else. He transformed the crown from a symbol to be displayed into a tool for action, bringing France back to the status of a European power. The transition from Henry III to Henry IV was not simply a change of king, but a change of governing mindset. From a politics of stagecraft, ceremony, and symbolism to a politics of action, compromise, and results. If Henry III was the final chapter of a romantic, tragic novel, then Henry IV was the opening chapter of a new epic, practical, enduring, and ambitious. And though they were so different, one thing cannot be denied. Both understood that in 16th century France, to keep the crown required not only swords but also the art of mastering hearts and minds. When Henry IV passed through the gates of Paris in 1594, the city was far from the splendid image it had held under Henry III. The cobbled streets once glowing with candlelight were now scarred by years of war, walls blackened by fire, markets deserted, and the eyes of the people filled with suspicion. He understood that military victory was only the beginning to truly be king. He had to heal the wounds of an entire nation. The first thing Henry IV did was to reassure the people of Paris. He appeared not in battle armor, but in simple clothes, riding slowly through the neighborhoods, stopping to shake hands with bakers, greeting vegetable sellers, and even visiting the poorer quarters that had once fiercely opposed him. These gestures were not only diplomatic acts, but also a message this king had not come for revenge, but to rebuild. At court, Henry IV set about financial reform. The French treasury was empty, weighed down by debts from years of religious war. He appointed capable ministers, such as Maximilien de Bethune, Duke of Sully, to manage the budget. Together, they worked tirelessly, cutting extravagant court spending, raising taxes more fairly, and most importantly, fighting corruption. If Henry III had been known for building a glittering court, then Henry IV wanted to build a strong administrative system to sustain the country. He also placed special focus on agriculture. Abandoned fields were encouraged to be cultivated again. Irrigation canals were improved. In Henry IV's eyes, a strong nation began with well-fed peasants, and his motto, "Every peasant will have a chicken in the pot on Sunday," became a symbolic promise. In foreign affairs, Henry IV inherited a tense Europe. Spain remained the eternal rival, while England, under Elizabeth I, was both ally and unpredictable partner. Henry IV skillfully maintained balance, keeping France out of major wars, while preserving diplomatic strength. This contrasted with Henry III, who had focused more on internal issues and court ceremony, leaving little impact on the international stage. Yet despite their differences, there was a curious thread connecting Henry IV and Henry III. Many at court recalled that Henry IV, though a pragmatic warrior, retained some of his predecessor's refinement. He did not completely abolish the court rituals established by Henry III. Instead, he simplified them, turning them into diplomatic tools. Banquets under Henry IV were no longer wastefully lavish, but still grand enough to impress foreign envoys. The shadow of Henry III still lingered within the walls of the Louvre, in the paintings and collections of art he had left behind. Henry IV did not destroy that legacy, for he understood that art was also part of a nation's soft power. Some even said that on a quiet evening, Henry IV once walked through the galleries Henry III had loved, paused before a portrait of his predecessor, and quietly said, "You ruled in your way. Now it is my turn." As Henry IV gradually consolidated power, the echoes of Henry III's reign remained in people's memory. To some, he was still the eccentric, extravagant, and weak king. But to those who had witnessed him balancing political storms for years, Henry III was an image of persistence and subtlety, a man who dared to live true to himself. Even if hidden under layers of ritual, the transition from Henry III to Henry IV was like changing the heartbeat of an entire nation. From a dynasty that valued ceremony, symbols, and extravagance, France shifted to one that valued pragmatism, results, and long-term stability. Henry III was the final chapter of an era where power and art merged into one. Henry IV was the opening of a new era, where power was measured by roads rebuilt, fields replanted, and full meals on the tables of the people. And looking back, you see that both left their mark. Henry III, with his splendid court and mysterious private life, remains one of the most fascinating figures in French history. Henry IV, with his political skill and healing touch, became the people's king, the one who laid the foundation for a unified and stable France after decades of division. After more than a decade of rule, Henry IV had transformed France from a war-weary nation into one reborn. Paris began to bustle again. More markets opened. Merchants from Italy, Spain, and even the Ottoman Empire brought goods. New bridges were built, streets paved more cleanly, oil lamps appeared in central districts, making Parisian nights less dark. But Henry IV did not stop at stabilization. He wanted France to reach beyond its borders, to engage more deeply in international trade. Colonial expansion projects were launched, including strengthening France's presence in Canada and the Caribbean. He encouraged monopoly trading companies, modeled after what the Dutch and English were doing. If Henry III had used art and ceremony to create prestige, Henry IV used commerce and diplomatic alliances. In his personal life, Henry IV was far from the discretion of Henry III. He was famously amorous, with many affairs outside of marriage, and had children with several mistresses. But even in these love stories, Henry IV showed his pragmatic nature. Many of his relationships had political elements, designed to strengthen alliances with powerful families. Yet this king did not forget ordinary people. He often made unannounced inspections, speaking directly with the populace to hear their complaints. Anecdotes tell of him, during a visit to a small village, sitting to eat with peasants, drinking local wine, and upon leaving, ordering a tax reduction for the entire region. This helped build his image as approachable, in stark contrast to the distance of many monarchs of the time. But just as France was growing more peaceful, the undercurrents of conspiracy still blew. Some extremist Catholic nobles had not forgiven him for once being a Protestant. Opponents feared his foreign policy plans would drag France into costly wars. Tensions rose in the year 1610, when Henry IV prepared to intervene militarily in southern Germany to halt Habsburg expansion. On May 14th, 1610, Paris was preparing for a coronation, but not of the king. It was for Queen Marie de' Medici, who was about to be crowned regent, as Henry planned to march to war. That morning, the king left the palace in a simple carriage, without many guards, partly because he believed Paris was safe. But when his carriage became stuck in a narrow street, a man named François Ravaillac, a fanatical Catholic, rushed forward and stabbed the king repeatedly. Henry IV died shortly after. The king's death shocked France. The people of Paris, who had loved him for his closeness and his king of the people policies, flooded the streets to mourn. Amid the tolling of church bells echoing through the capital, they recalled his promises, his reforms, and even the meals he had once shared with them. Marie de' Medici became regent for their son, Louis XIII, but she lacked Henry IV's decisiveness and pragmatism. Within just a few years, the court fell into factional strife, ushering in a new period of instability. Many began to look back nostalgically at Henry IV. Just as before, they had once longed for Henry III, each with his own ruling style, but both leaving a void difficult to fill. If Henry III was the symbol of a dazzling, dramatic court, then Henry IV was the model of a pragmatic, patriotis, and approachable king. The transition from Henry III to Henry IV was like changing the heartbeat of the nation, from a heart beating to the rhythm of festival music, to one pounding with the steps of marching soldiers and the hammering of bridge builders. And perhaps the most fascinating thing is that, though the two men were so different, they left France with the same lesson: the crown cannot endure without adaptability. Henry III adapted by creating a world of his own, where ritual and art were his political weapons. Henry IV adapted by changing himself, from a Protestant leader into a Catholic king, to unify the country. Looking back, history often compares these two reigns as opposite poles, one of form, one of substance. But when you connect them, you see they were not separate at all, but like two pieces of a puzzle, each completing what the other lacked, creating a full picture of France at the threshold of the 17th century, both splendid and solid, both romantic and pragmatic. Though they left the throne centuries ago, the shadows of Henry III and Henry IV still linger in the cobblestones of Paris, in the cold walls of the Louvre, and in France's conception of royal power. These two kings, each in his own style, left undercurrents that continued to shape the Bourbon dynasty and European history. Henry III, with his lavish court and stage-like refinement, etched into the memory of the French nobility a unique image that the king was not only the ruler, but also the aesthetic symbol of the nation. Thanks to him, many court rituals and fashion standards were established, later maintained and expanded under future monarchs, especially under Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis XIV may have differed from Henry III in personality and ambition, but the way he transformed Versailles into the center of European power and art was an indirect legacy from Henry III's time. But Henry III also left a bitter lesson. A splendid court isolated from the lives of the people could be easily cut off and weakened before political storms. Later kings, even when enthralled by magnificence, could not forget that distance from the people had helped lead to his downfall. In contrast, Henry IV left his mark through pragmatism and closeness. His Sunday chicken policy became a symbol of people-centered leadership. Many financial, agricultural, and commercial reforms he initiated laid the foundation for France's prosperity in the 17th century. After his assassination, subsequent kings, whether more or less, still had to consider the element of winning the people's favor, a rare concept in an absolute monarchy. Henry IV's Edict of Nantes, though revoked decades later, was also a landmark. It showed that in an age when religion could determine the fate of nations, compromise and coexistence were still possible. This idea, though forgotten during more extreme times, planted seeds for the modern political concept of religious tolerance. The influence of Henry III and Henry IV even extended beyond France's borders. European courts watched Paris closely. Spain and the Italian states learned from Henry III's use of ceremony as a diplomatic tool, while England and the Netherlands noted Henry IV's combination of economic policy and political stability to consolidate power. In popular culture, the images of these two kings also followed very different paths. Henry III often appeared in plays and novels as a mysterious figure, half real, half imagined, both powerful and fragile, carrying a sense of personal tragedy. Henry IV, by contrast, was remembered as Le Bon Roi Henry, the good King Henry, a warm, approachable figure, beloved by the people. These two images, opposite yet complementary, became two different archetypes of kingship in the French imagination. From a historical perspective, the succession from Henry III to Henry IV was a rare test. Could a nation transition from a dynasty focused on form, ceremony, and courtly splendor to one built on pragmatism, action, and closeness to the people without losing the majesty of the crown? The answer, at least in this period, was yes. France not only survived that transformation but entered the 17th century stronger both economically and in international influence. Yet the deeper lesson may be this. Each reign responded to the shortcomings of the one before. Henry III, caught up in ceremony and the whirl of court politics, created a distance that Henry IV was compelled to close with pragmatism and closeness, but without the cultural, artistic, and ceremonial foundation that Henry III had built. Henry IV might not have been able to establish international prestige so quickly. Today, when walking through the galleries of the Louvre or the old streets of Paris, you can still see traces of both. In one hall, portraits in lavish robes and ornate jewelry recall Henry III. In another square, the equestrian statue of Henry IV on the Pont Neuf reminds us of a king who once walked those very streets to speak with his people. Perhaps this is how history tells their story, not through dry pages, but through stones, paintings, bridges, and legends that live on in memory. And when the story of Henry III and Henry IV closes, it does not truly end, for their legacy still lingers in the decisions of later monarchs, and in the way the French understand the relationship between power and humanity. After Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, the crown passed to his son Louis XIII, only 9 years old. The widowed queen, Maria de' Medici, served as regent. In the early years under her guidance, the court returned to an atmosphere of elaborate ceremony, the kind Henry III had loved, but without his artistic refinement, leaning instead toward ostentation and factionalism. Banquets, dances, and the extravagance of certain nobles made the people begin to compare and long for the closeness of the good King Henry. Marie de' Medici also fell into factional politics with powerful families, neglecting much of the economic reform Henry IV had begun. The result was that the treasury once again fell into strain. If Henry III had left the lesson of the dangers of being too distant from the people, Marie de' Medici was repeating it. But without his cultural brilliance, when Louis XIII came of age, he gradually seized power from his mother. And this was when a new figure stepped onto the stage, Cardinal Richelieu. With sharp intellect and vast ambition, Richelieu nearly resurrected the spirit of Henry IV's pragmatism. But in a far colder form, he consolidated royal power, tightened control over the nobility, and expanded France's influence in Europe through the 30 Years' War. Yet Richelieu did not neglect imagery. He understood, as Henry III had, that a court must appear majestic to make enemies tremble. Thus, alongside strengthening the army and diplomacy, he also invested in art and architecture, paving the way for an era when royal power was displayed through magnificence, reaching its peak under Louis XIV. When Louis XIV came to the throne, the picture was complete. The Sun King had learned from Henry III how to turn the court into a stage of power, and from Henry IV how to use policy to stabilize the people and strengthen the state. Versailles became the embodiment of this synthesis, ceremonies staged with flawless splendor. But beneath them, a powerful administrative machine controlling both domestic and foreign affairs. If you walk into Versailles, you can see traces of Henry III in the arrangement of banquets, the rituals of receiving envoys, and the royal fashions. And you can see the shadow of Henry IV in the infrastructure projects, trade, and agricultural policies maintained to support such extravagance. Two seemingly opposite styles had fused, creating the model of French absolutism, both enchanting and fearsome to the rest of Europe. Interestingly, later French kings had to learn how to walk the tightrope between these two styles, lean too far toward Henry III, and they risked losing the people through extravagance and ritual. Lean too far toward Henry IV, and they risked losing the majesty of the crown in the eyes of the world. Each subsequent reign was a variation on this equation, until the entire system of absolute monarchy collapsed at the end of the 18th century. And when the French Revolution erupted, the people of Paris smashed royal statues and burned many symbols of monarchy. Yet there were strange moments when some elderly voices in the crowd said Henry IV. He was different. He was closer to us. That phrase, like a wisp of smoke, drifted through the fire of revolution, reminding that the memory of a king of the people could outlive even the fall of the crown. And Henry III. He was not often mentioned in the fiery speeches of the Revolution, but in the theatres of Paris, the image of the eccentric king, at once strong and fragile, remained a dramatic figure on stage. Plays set in his time always drew audiences, because his story was not only about politics, but also about human tragedy, something every age understands and empathizes with. Thus, even when you travel the whole journey from Henry III through Henry IV, Louis XIII, Richelieu, Louis XIV, to the final days of monarchy, you see one red thread. The eternal question, should a king be a beautiful symbol for the people to look up to, or a close figure for them to trust? Henry III and Henry IV gave two different answers, and their opposition created one of the richest and most nuanced periods in French history. One winter evening in 1585, snow fell thick on the roof of the Louvre. Henry III sat alone in a closed chamber, before a large gold-framed mirror. He wore a silver silk gown newly sent from Italian tailors, candlelight glinting off every embroidered thread. As the servant shut the heavy door, Henry tilted his head to try on a feathered hat, smiling to himself, as if the outside world no longer existed. But suddenly, urgent knocking broke the silence. It was an envoy from Venice, bringing urgent news. With no time to change, Henry simply threw on a heavy cloak and went out to meet him. The envoy, a man seasoned in courtly affairs, later recalled that moment vividly. Uncertain whether the figure before him was a king or a young noblewoman, Henry did not falter. He calmly negotiated an alliance against Spain, weaving compliments about Venetian art so deftly that the envoy felt both unsettled and charmed. They say it was precisely this grace that kept Venice in friendly relations with France for years after. On another occasion, Henry III hosted a secret masquerade, reserved only for a few close friends and his most loyal mignons. The rule of that night was simple, yet daring. Everyone had to cross-dress. Henry III became a haughty countess, while Queen Louise played the role of a Lorraine gentleman, complete with false beard and sword at her side. In the soft golden light, they danced, talked, and laughed as entirely different people. Freed from the roles that politics and history had imposed on them, no one outside was ever allowed to know what happened behind those closed doors. And that secret went with them to the grave. If Henry III lived in a world of ceremony and dreams, then Henry IV belonged to dusty roads and afternoons in the fields. Once, while travelling through Gascony, he saw a group of peasants repairing an old wooden bridge. Without warning, the king dismounted, rolled up his sleeves, and helped them lift the heavy planks, joking as he worked. A strong bridge is good for both king and people. Those present never forgot the sight, and the story spread quickly, adding to the image of the king of the people. Henry IV was also famous for his blunt speech, sometimes witty, yet profound. At one council meeting, when a noble complained that lowering taxes would empty the treasury, he only smiled and replied, "If the people are hungry, they cannot pay taxes, but if they are full, they will support both king and country." The phrase became one of his most oft-repeated quotes. Another time, on the road to Lyon, a group of children shouted, "Long live the king." Henry stopped his horse, handed them a few coins, and asked, "What will you buy?" One boy quickly replied, "Bread. But if the king gives more, I'll buy new shoes too." Henry laughed, pulled out more coins, and said, "Then buy both, so your stomach is full and your feet do not hurt." Though the two men lived in worlds apart, one dreaming among rituals, the other walking the dusty roads, sometimes their images touched in unexpected ways. It is said that after securing his throne, Henry IV once visited the Louvre and passed through the rooms Henry III had used for his transformations. He stopped before an old mirror, gently touched the wooden frame, and murmured to a courtier. They say he lived in dreams, but perhaps dreaming is harder than fighting. That remark became an invisible bridge between two dynasties on one side, candlelight glittering on silk. On the other, sunlight pouring over golden fields. And both, each in his own way, left indelible marks on French history. After Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, the French crown passed to his son, Louis XIII. Then, only 9 years old, the boy sat on a throne larger than his small frame, his feet not reaching the marble floor, his gaze wandering as if he could not yet grasp the weight of the crown. The widowed queen, Maria de Medici, stepped in as regent, and soon the court returned to elaborate ceremonies, endless banquets, and ostentatious displays of power. But unlike Henry III's refinement, these rituals were mere glitter, without the deep cultural and political foundation. The people quickly noticed the distance. They began to recall the days when Henry IV rode through villages, stopped to eat with peasants, or opened granaries to ease famine. And just as they had once longed for Henry III after his death, now they longed for Henry IV, though with a more practical regret. they missed a king who listened. When Louis XIII came of age, he gradually reclaimed power from his mother. But Louis XIII was not a king inclined toward openness or closeness with the people. He was reserved, discreet, sometimes inscrutable. And to govern, he turned to a man history would never forget, Cardinal Richelieu. With sharp intellect and iron ambition, Richelieu restored to the crown something Henry IV had once embodied: pragmatism, but in a far colder, harsher form. He did not hesitate to use every means to consolidate royal authority, crush noble plots, tightly control cities, and extend France's influence across Europe through the 30 Years' War. But Richelieu also understood Henry III's lesson: power must be accompanied by image to endure. Thus, alongside strengthening the army and diplomacy, he patronized art and architecture, using them as bricks to build a proud national image. By the time Louis XIV, an orphan of 5 who had witnessed the Fronde Rebellion shaking Paris, came to power, all the lessons of Henry III, Henry IV, and Richelieu had been woven into a perfect composition. Versailles rose like a palace of gods, where every corridor, every banquet, every ball was a message of power. Louis XIV carried the majesty and theatrical artistry of Henry III, yet also upheld the organization and control of Henry IV. Under Louis XIV, France entered what is considered its golden age. Its territory expanded. French culture dominated Europe, and the image of the Sun King was etched deep into memory. But Versailles, dazzling as it was, still needed a stable economy and society to sustain it. And that foundation, undeniably, came from the agricultural, commercial, and financial policies Henry IV had laid down nearly a century earlier. And so, from Henry III, the king of ritual and art, to Henry IV, the king of the people and of policy, to Richelieu, the iron hand in a velvet glove, and finally to Louis XIV, the man who turned power into blinding light. The flow of French history was seamless, like a silk ribbon. Each part dyed in its own color but woven into a unified tapestry. And there, the traces of 2 opposing kings, Henry III and Henry IV, still remained, like 2 different notes needed for the full music of monarchy to play. If you have followed me through this long story, by now you too can feel the breath of history slow, at times low, at times soaring, like the rhythm of waves lapping on an ancient river. From that snowy night on the roof of the Louvre, where Henry III sat before his mirror in a silver silk gown, to the warm afternoon in Gascony, when Henry IV rolled up his sleeves to help villagers carry planks for a bridge. These 2 images, which seem impossible to set side by side, are in fact 2 eyes of the same nation, gazing at the world from different angles. Henry III lived in a world of candlelight, gentle music, scented powders, and masked balls where he could escape the role of king to become who he wished. He loved beauty, refinement, the art of turning each audience into a living tableau. But the world outside was not as gentle as candlelight. It was a world of uprisings, dagger-bearing hands, and pamphlets full of malice. Henry III was trapped between 2 kingdoms, one of politics, one of the soul, and both demanded him entirely. Henry IV came to the crown from the battlefield, with dust still clinging to his armor, and the breath of horses hot in the air. He knew the weight of poverty, the value of a sturdy bridge, of a full field. He knew that a pot of chicken on Sunday could inspire more loyalty than the grandest coronation, and he accepted changing his faith to unify the country, a pragmatic but necessary choice, because he knew a crown could not be placed on cracked ground. These 2 men, these 2 styles, left France with opposing yet complementary legacies, Henry III gave the nation art, ritual, and the power of image. Henry IV gave it an economic foundation, closeness to the people, and the idea that power only has meaning when it serves life. History does not stop when a king dies. Louis XIII and Richelieu inherited Henry IV's pragmatism, but also learned from Henry III how to use ritual as a political tool. Louis XIV, with radiant Versailles, combined both the theatrical splendor of a court with the strong economic and social base to sustain it. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a symbol of French power. The light kindled by different kings, beginning with the small candle in Henry III's chamber, to the blazing fire on Henry IV's battlefield camp. And then, when absolute monarchy ended in the late 18th century, statues were smashed, emblems destroyed. Yet the memory of these two kings lingered. In Parisian theatres, Henry III lived again on stage, both regal and tragic. In folk tales, Henry IV remained the good king, the one who stopped his horse to speak with children along the road. There is something fascinating about historical memory. Like a dream, it does not clearly separate light from shadow. It preserves what touches the heart. A witty phrase, a masked ball, a meal with peasants, and lets the rest fade like mist. Thus, when we look back, Henry III is not only the last Valois king assassinated, and Henry IV is not only the first Bourbon king assassinated. They are two parallel stories of how a man tries to fulfill the role history gives him, while still seeking to be himself. Now, picture this, a quiet night, somewhere in old Paris. On the Pont Neuf, the statue of Henry IV on horseback still stands, gazing out over the Seine. A little farther away, in a gallery of the Louvre, the great gold-framed mirror still reflects those who pass. And perhaps, just perhaps, it still holds the faint shadow of Henry III in his silver gown. Beneath the moonlight, the two symbols coexist, one of action, one of dreams, and both belong to the history of the same nation. As the story closes, I want you to remember that history is not only a chain of dry events, but also of very human moments. Henry III's soft smile behind powder and rouge. Henry IV, stopping by the roadside to help a hand trembling in the cold wind. These moments, small as they seem, are strong enough to cross centuries and reach us today. And perhaps the greatest lesson from both is this: there is no single formula for ruling, just as there is no single mold for living. Some choose ritual, others pragmatism. Some live in dreams, others in dust. But if you leave behind something good, whether a dance or a bridge, then you have contributed to the shared story of the world. Now you can close your eyes. Imagine the sound of Henry III's court lute, echoing somewhere, blending with the distant hoofbeats of Henry IV. They do not clash, but harmonize, like two different winds blowing through the old stone streets of Paris. Candlelight and sunlight meet upon the Seine, and Paris, the city that has witnessed it all, still sleeps under the night sky. If outside it is a quiet night, let the sound of history guide you into sleep. Every king, every dynasty, passes like the seasons, but their stories and the emotions they carry remain like a small flame, always burning in humanity's memory. May you dream sweetly, where you might walk the halls of the Louvre and see Henry III adjusting his silk gown, or cross a golden field to shake Henry IV's hand. And when you wake, remember you are both the storyteller and a part of the story itself. Sleep well.